Hello, listeners. I'm Kathy Fang with Below the Radar, a knowledge democracy podcast. Below the Radar is recorded on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. On this episode of Below the Radar B-Sides, our host Am Johal is joined by Lauren Wendling, Director of Institutional Success at Collaboratory. Together, they chat about community engagement in higher education, how Lauren got involved in the work, and the evaluation and evolution of the field. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, welcome to Below the Radar. Delighted that you could join us again this week. We are very delighted to have Lauren Wendling with us to talk about community engagement. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, wondering if we can begin with you introducing yourself a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am Lauren Wendling. I currently reside in the U.S., so in the States, in Indianapolis, Indiana. I come to this work through a community engagement lens. I'm currently positioned at Collaboratory, so I serve as their Director of Institutional Success. So I get to work with a lot of campuses who are really working to strategically collect and assess and evaluate data around their community engagement at the institutional level. So that's my day-to-day. Also just very involved in community myself. That's kind of how I came into this work. So really involved with my local neighborhood association, play softball for the Special Olympics. So yeah, just try to ground myself in community. And yeah, that's where I'm from.
Mm-hmm. I want to go deeper into that a little bit because obviously, similarly, I work in community engagement in higher education. I've met with people across the country, different institutions in Montreal and New Orleans, Toronto, Saskatoon. I always like to ask people kind of the origin stories of how they gravitated to this work. And so how did you first get involved in community engagement in higher education?
Yeah, I also really enjoy hearing the different pathways that people take. I find that it's often very unique, but similar in the same ways. So I was really introduced to the concept of community engagement as an undergrad, as I was a Bonner Scholar. I went to DePaul University and got to be a Bonner Scholar there and was essentially just encouraged to engage with my community in a lot of different ways. So I got to try out a lot of different engagement types. So some more direct service, some more planning behind the scenes, and really just got to experience what it was to be engaged in community from the university perspective. So that really kind of launched me into my love of community engagement. As a lot of folks in the field, I feel my initial default after graduation was, I really like this engagement work. What should I do? So went into the nonprofit space and I worked at an organization called Best Buddies for a handful of years to help facilitate social friendships and interactions between folks with and without intellectual disabilities. And really appreciated that work. I worked with all of the institutions in Indiana specifically with their faculty advisors and students and other community partners and really helped to facilitate engagement from the nonprofit perspective and really enjoyed that. Got my master's in ed leadership at that time. And that's when I started to cue more into, how do things work from the institutional perspective? Because I'd experienced it as a student, got to see it from the nonprofit side, and then was just really interested in understanding how institutions think about and essentially decide how and when and where they engage with community. So just started networking with folks that I knew that were in the space, and coffees and chats led me to a lot of different people, specifically in Indianapolis. And I eventually got looped into a handful of wonderful folks at IU Indianapolis, which is then IUPUI, and met who ended up being a really close friend and mentor of mine, Dr. Kristen Norris, who at that time worked in the Office of Community Engagement at IUPUI. And she said, hey, I think we think about this work really similarly. Why don't you come and be my GA and you can get your doc in our higher ed program at IU Bloomington, and we'll see what we can do about it. So I worked at IUPUI for about 3 years while pursuing my Ph.D. in higher ed with a focus on community engagement. And that's when I was really introduced to the idea of data around community engagement and understanding at the institutional level what it means to be an engaged institution and the variety of forms that takes. And while I was at IUPUI working in the data assessment evaluation lens, that's when IUPUI chose to be a beta tester, an institution for Collaboratory, a software tool that helps campuses capture their engagement and aggregates and disaggregates data in a lot of really cool ways to help with strategic decision making. So I helped to implement Collaboratory at IUPUI and really saw the benefit of having system-wide or institution-wide community engagement data to fuel a lot of decision-making and to just better tell the story of engagement across a campus. And then an opportunity came about to join the Collaboratory team and help other campuses do that exact same work. So that's where I've been for the past 6 or so years. And now, like I said earlier, get to work with a variety of institutions who come at this work in a lot of different ways. Think about how they can position and understand their community engagement efforts to address all of the things that they need and want to address in and with community. So that's kind of just my roundabout way of making it here. And just, really appreciate the different perspectives that I've been able to have as a student and then as a nonprofit partner, and then now kind of on the back end from the institutional view and then from a more national perspective now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how people come into this area of work, either, from within the institution, or myself have done community organizing before and worked with UBC in the late 90s on some community programming. And now to function at that intersection again, in my context, I'm next to the inner city in Vancouver at an art school, very heavily gentrifying neighborhood, a lot of social challenges here, but also a lot of beauty, a lot of amazing things happening, and an opportunity to work collaboratively with people. And one of the things, I think about often, there's different terminologies we have in the academy to think about it. It's almost kind of like the porousness of the institution, both in terms of how universities can break down its walls and be in community, but also how communities can enter into institutional spaces that are more welcoming, that bring down barriers. And so how do ideas move in and outside the institution? And how do we create those spaces that can be reciprocal and valuable, or open up new spaces that are both mutually beneficial, but also justice oriented, and to kind of break down some of the hierarchies between higher education and community in the various ways that it's defined. I'm wondering how you think through those notions of, the barriers and walls between institutions and communities and hierarchies that exist. It comes up inevitably in any type of context and city that you'd be working out of, but I thought I would start with asking that.
Yeah, I think those are ever present in a lot of different ways, right? Institutional context plays a huge role, but when thinking in the broader landscape, I typically tend to see the two biggest barriers or challenges in terms of that porousness, right, as you described, and how community and institution can best meet in the middle. I see a lot of tension around the alignment of efforts and the needs or the vision that communities may have, and how that differs than the needs and vision that institutions see that they need or that they have, right? So identifying and trying to define the impact or the goals or the outcomes that both community and institutions want to achieve, those are often different and often difficult to align those efforts if they're not in quality communication, which often leads to confusion. In a lot of ways, I think that the community views institutions as individual entities, right, that are obviously comprised of various levels of leadership and individual faculty and different centers and units. And even within institutions themselves, the alignment of efforts is often very difficult to come to terms with. Faculty often define and understand their engagement work differently than maybe their discipline or their reporting unit, different than the institution themselves understands and identifies engagement. And then those definitions and understandings often differ from the community and their needs. So first and foremost, being able to understand what is currently happening on your campus in terms of engagement is paramount, to then work towards a better alignment and understanding of combined efforts to try to get on that same page. And then that siloing effect, specifically in institutions, I see as another big challenge that campuses have in terms of strategically pushing the needle forward in the ways that are aligned with both their institution and the community. So as community engagement is now more so, I think, being seen as a strategy through which campuses do a lot of things, right? It's the way their faculty research, it's the way their students learn. It's the way that they often bring funding dollars into the institution. But though it's often kind of this more dispersed or understood strategy, that the form of engagement takes a lot of different forms, I guess you could say. So the siloing of efforts around engagement on campuses often I see as another really big challenge in aligning this work, right? So that's often takes the place of like the siloing of data collection, right? Data on community engagement is often very siloed and very specific to certain individual faculty needs or disciplinary needs. The siloing of community engagement in structures like promotion and tenure, right? So as faculty might not be as apt to understand or recognize the way that they could bring engagement into their teaching and their research, or the siloing of engagement in even like strategic plans and how campuses think of it as this one thing that we do over here. So I really see the two biggest challenges or barriers is how to reduce the siloing of efforts to have a larger institutional vision where that can be aligned not just within the institution, but within the community itself, so that community members see themselves and institutions see themselves as working towards that one of many shared goals as it relates to engagement or community impact.
Yeah, I wanted to come to the tenure and promotion thing in a bit, but I'm going to maybe start with asking a question around I know that in the US, the Carnegie classification has been around for quite some time. And in Canada, there's a pilot project about to start. And for our listeners who might not be aware of what that is, if you could share a little bit of the context in the US of how the Carnegie classification has unfolded and maybe some of the benefits or challenges of utilizing that as a framework to evaluate community engagement in terms of institutional strategy.
Yeah, the Carnegie classification for community engagement is something that I just personally and professionally and as a scholar have seen really impact the ways that campuses are thinking about engagement, specifically how they're institutionalizing or working to institutionalize engagement across their campuses. As the Carnegie classification is really designed to be not the end of itself, right? Like though campuses are working to receive the classification, the real prize, I guess you could say, is the effort and the act of applying for the designation and doing the work in order to be designated. So really leveraging the classification as a means to an end and something that is really important for campuses to dig into, not just to be designated, but to understand what it means to be designated. So that often takes the role in a lot of different ways, right? So thinking about how engagement touches the various aspects of your campus, how it touches promotion and tenure, how it's woven into your mission and your vision and your strategic planning, how it's funneled into your student learning, and now how it touches your civic engagement and your institution's civic identity. So I've seen it advance more, at least from my perspective, and working with campuses that both have the designation and are working to receive or be reclassified for it, really seeing it as a lever to get the folks that are at their core, the community engagement professionals, using Carnegie as a lever to get their larger institutions, the individual faculty members, and then their senior leadership too often on board with, this is something that's meaningful, not just to our institution, but to the larger field of higher education. It's a way that we can help to distinguish ourselves as an institution, and specifically as an institution that is deeply ingrained and engaged with our community. So again, using it as that lever for change, and not just something, a 100-page report that they get to write, but really doing the work to ensure that engagement is deep and meaningful and pervasive across their campus. And this is a huge lever to further advance that work for campuses that choose to dig into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I've had many conversation with some scholars in the field who you probably know, people like Timothy Eatman and Barbara Holland. And it's interesting to see, the term community engagement can oftentimes circulate inside of institutions in terms of the lay usage of the word, rather than a more precise definition within higher education. And oftentimes that distinction can speak to the level of rigor or not with which institutions are carrying the work forward. So that's, I think, one of the challenges. I've been to conferences like the International Association on Research in Service Learning and Community Engagement, IR SLICE, as it's called, or the Coalition of Urban Metropolitan Universities, CUMO, where usually there's 3 or 4 panels at each of those that are about, like, how do we evaluate community engagement? The traditional methods don't quite understand us, and we've developed this method. And every time I go there, it's continuing evolution. And what is the common theme is that everyone is struggling with this, both in terms of figuring out how to do this evaluation, how to report out internally, how to report out to external funding, how to report out to communities. And we also have the specificity of place and neighborhoods and context that they're working in. And so there's no easy, it oftentimes is a hybrid form of evaluation where we're taking things from the nonprofit sector, or if we have specific disciplines like arts and culture, trying to look at those ways of describing stories. And so I know that you do a lot of this work in trying to do some sense making of trying to tell the story, but also to speak to impact and all of those. So I'm wondering if you could share just a little bit of the work that you're doing, and maybe some best practices and examples of institutions that are doing this in an interesting way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the terms community engagement and then impact in and of themselves are very heavy and loaded, right? They mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people and a lot of different communities. So definitely big grain of salt there in terms of there's not, or I don't personally prescribe to one set definition of impact or what impact should mean, or really community engagement in that matter. I think community engagement often, or should often, serve as kind of an umbrella term under which a lot of different iterations of it can fall. It's while I and Collaboratory often or do understand engagement through the lens of the Carnegie definition, right? That deep, mutually beneficial, reciprocal partnership work that, again, can take a lot of different iterations. So, as I said, big grain of salt there in terms of how there are multiple definitions and ways of understanding this. But when it comes to the tension that often exists between how do we capture and look at and understand our institution's engagement and impact in community, there again comes into play, right, the different lenses through which you can look at data or the larger or more granular story. So big, broad brushstrokes, I have personally just seen the evolution of the way that many campuses are thinking about data around engagement really move away from large quantitative numbers in terms of impact to more broader understandings of impact, specifically designed with community voice in mind. So I often share the example of years ago, I'd say maybe 5 to 10 years ago, I saw across the field many, many campuses reporting out on what I and some colleagues call like the 5 fabulous numbers of engagement. And that those were typically these are the numbers that we report to say how good at engagement we are. And those often tended to be, as an institution, how many students were engaged in the community this academic year? How many faculty were engaged? How many community partners did we engage with? How many hours did we spend in community? And then how many courses had an engaged component? And those were typically what I have seen and continue to see in some instances, campuses report on to say, look at us, we have really high numbers, so we're doing engagement well. And obviously quantitative counts don't necessarily talk about the depth or even the breadth necessarily of engagement. So a lot of the work that I and Collaboratory do with campuses is to move away from that type of measurement or impact reporting, away from these siloed quantitative counts of impact, or what might be defined as impact, and more into the understanding of what is happening within the community and what is driving the various ways that impact is defined by an institution and community. So I would say in the evolution of the ways that campuses are thinking about their engagement, to not center or start with quantitative counts, but to lean more into the storytelling aspects of what's happening in the community, moving away from more quantitative counts of impact and into more qualitative understandings of what is happening to reach desired impact outcomes. So I do still see a lot of campuses really reaching towards wanting a larger framework for understanding impact, and that I often see campuses relying on like framing their engagement through the lens of like sustainable development goals. And what are we doing to address the SDGs that are important to us in our community? Or what, I'll take the example of, so I mentioned I'm based in Indiana and Indianapolis, and within our larger state and state legislature, K-12 education is one of the predominant issues around which we as a state are continually talking about, right? Why don't we have more K-12 graduates? Why are we lacking in the number of teachers that we're able to educate that are staying within the state? So I've seen specifically the Indiana University system really drive and look at their community engagement through the lens of K-12 education and what is IU doing to address K-12 and teacher education in the state. That is the lens through which they are focusing impact in a lot of ways. And it's not the sole lens, but that is something that they have used as a framework to understand their impact, because it is so paramount to the state by and large. So trying to find those larger frameworks around which can be those umbrellas to tell an institutional story of impact at the more aggregate institutional level, to say our institution is doing X, Y, and Z to address impact as we've defined it through K-12 attrition rates or through SDGs, but then also paying attention to the more granular storytelling aspect of engagement, the more often than not, the feel-good stories, right, that folks can see themselves within. So there's the data through the larger institutional frame, but then also the data through the lens of the individual faculty member or the department or the school and what they're doing to address their very specific definitions of impact. So I'm rarely, if ever, would advocate for a solid definition of impact or ways to report it at the across the entire institution, recognizing that there are those different levels that are important to different stakeholders, internal and external to the institution. So I think, again, as I'm seeing the evolution of evaluation and understanding of community engagement through data change, it's away from big 5 numbers and into more nuanced, specific stories and reporting through different lenses based on the stakeholders which are involved in the discussion. So your external community partners, your funders, your public figures, and then also your internal stakeholders within the institution. So your senior leadership, your deans and department chairs, how they define impact is often very different even within the institution. So I think that I very much advocate and have campuses advocate for defining impact and see how community engagement flows into those different definitions of impact based on their specific context. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I forgot to mention, I want to say congratulations as well on winning the Early Career Researcher Award with IR Slice. Want to speak about, as this work has many evolutions and histories of how it comes to be, and even terms like community engagement have a kind of history. And at least in the context of my own university that I work at SFU, people were doing this work in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s. They just didn't call it community engagement. And so, there's moments where the evolution at my own institution or the advance of it, certainly supported by senior leadership, but also philanthropy that came in through external relations over a period of time. And now the evolution of it is really kind of a more deeper and intentional engagement with the teaching and research mission of the university. There's various ways that these processes unfold in each institution, and urban or rural region is different. But wondering if you could speak just a little bit to how higher education institutions are situating community engagement work. There's, of course, a lot of proponents and supporters, but also for some professors, oftentimes they're so focused on the teaching and the research side of the work, it can feel like an add-on for some people that are newer to this work. And I guess thirdly would just be what you mentioned earlier, which is the real challenges around evaluation for tenure and promotion. That how is this work valued in a rigorous way than simply another sort of part of knowledge mobilization? How can it be viewed as a scholarly activity in and of itself? I think these continue to be pernicious questions related to community engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. I am very much of the belief that the internal institutional systems and structures like promotion and tenure, those that are deeply ingrained within higher education, must be reflective of the institutions that we want to be. And if we, the collective we, the institution wants to be understood as and promoted as and hang their hat on being an engaged institution and have that identity and image, then they need the systems and structures internally to reflect that and to draw folks that want to be a part of that into their campus. And I think promotion and tenure is one of, if not the largest, hindrance to institutions like that in a lot of ways. Recognizing that nothing happens quickly in higher ed, and I'm not necessarily advocating for quick and swift change, but recognizing that this is a conversation that I can't even say we, because this has been long before I even joined the field, that the field has been having for years and years, if not decades, right? In terms of how do we appropriately balance the need and the desire for us to be deeply ingrained in our community, and while also supporting faculty that want to do it. Because I completely agree. So many faculty see this as an additional thing that they do, not because they get, recognized and rewarded and promoted on it, but because it is who they are as an individual. It's who they are as a scholar. And there's a lot of different ways to attack that. But I think at the heart of it, it's the way that we train our faculty and our leadership within institutions. I mean, just in my personal experience as someone who went through a PhD program, knew instantly, like, I didn't want to be a faculty member because I didn't want to have to produce X amount of research over X amount of time just to stay within, the profession, and felt that I could make more change being outside of the academy in that way. And I absolutely loved my grad program and felt that it really set me up for the success that I want to have within my career and profession. But I really think that we, just as higher education in general, need to reconsider the ways that we train our incoming faculty to centralize engagement as a strategy or as a methodology, right, through which you can research. It's the way you can teach. It's not just this additional thing. And we're starting to see that, right, as the groundswell of newer generations, or should I say younger generations, are coming into the profession and advocating from the ground up that these things need to change. But we're also seeing a lot of that tension between the senior leadership, who often typically tend to be of another generation who came up through the ranks in different ways and feel that in some aspects, younger faculty need to pay their dues, right? You have to be promoted in the same way I did or was, and then you get to do your engagement, right? Because then it's the time for fun. So I think we really need to rethink that. And in that rethinking, it's the foundational piece, I think, of that is one, an institution needs to recognize and understand, like, if we're an engaged campus, we have to walk the talk and we need to make change here. That's the first and foundational thing. And I think things like Carnegie often help to grease the wheels there, to suggest that, or to have institutional leadership say, yes, this is something we care about. After that, I think you typically tend to see institutions bite into or chew on guideline reform. So within their P&T guidelines, reforming the language within how engagement is infused into teaching, into research. And it's not just the standalone service piece, right? It needs to be understood as that methodology, as so many scholars have said in the past. So it's guideline reform at the institutional level, but also at the school and or department level. I see across the field so many campuses, when they start to dive into the work of like P&T reform, they start at the institutional level and they change their institutional level guidelines and like, hey, we did it. That's great. Now everything will fall into place. But faculty get promoted through their department and through their school. And it's often decided by the time it reaches the institutional level, right? So if guidelines aren't changed at those department and school levels, it often is somewhat in vain. So even after that all trickles down and you have guidelines that are reflective of and inclusive of engaged research and scholarship and teaching, then too comes the third piece of the puzzle, which I think is the most challenging oftentimes, is changing the evaluative metrics of how faculty are evaluated when it comes to their scholarship and their teaching. I see even in campuses where they have really significant guideline reform efforts, the metrics that they use to evaluate their engaged faculty are still the same. It's how many peer-reviewed journal articles did you have? What are your journal impact factors? What do letters from other scholars across the country say about you, right? That's what's going to get you promoted or get you tenure. And it's not, well, what do your community partners think about the work that you've done? Maybe you didn't write, 6 journal articles a year, but you significantly pushed through a huge piece of legislation, right, for your local community. So really revising the ways that we evaluate and think about engagement in scholarship and in teaching. And that often entirely means bringing in the voice of community partners as equal and representative reviewers of that work, right? If they're the ones, if they are the partners that your faculty are working with, it's much more meaningful about what they say about your work as opposed to someone across the country who read one of your articles 2 years ago, right? So it's then again, like that third puzzle piece is the metrics to really change. So then faculty, when they're right out of their doc program and fall into that cycle of what do I need to do to get promoted, they see, oh, I can develop a 10-year-long project with a community partner where we're working not necessarily to publish 3 articles every year, but when we're really working towards impactful goals that will be of assistance to the community partner and not just to myself to get promoted. Does that get to the question?
Yeah, yes, definitely.
Okay.
I was going to ask you about, what changes you see on the horizon in terms of trends related to the evolution of community engagement in higher education. And what are some universities that you see as exemplars or trailblazers working in this area in terms of new directions?
Mm-hmm. In terms of trends, one of the biggest trends that I see is the ways that a lot of campuses are changing the way that they tell their story about engagement and the lenses through which they are presenting that story as an engaged institution. So really managing and leveraging community engagement as a core central piece of their image and their identity, not just to bring in engaged scholars or faculty members or students, but really to kind of as a PR and a marketing tool in a way to explain to the public why higher education is so important when there's such a high level of distrust, specifically in the States, about what's the point of higher ed, right? So speaking a different language in terms of why engagement is important and impactful, and how it is a specific differentiator for them, and how they are also unique to other campuses in their city or region, right? Because they still need to bring students into campus. So I see a big change in how the storytelling component of engagement is kind of evolving to meet a lot of different stakeholder needs. I would say some campuses that I see do this really well. So like Arizona State comes to mind. They are a huge institution, right? One of, if not the largest in the country. And the way that they are bringing community engagement, their term social embeddedness, into all aspects of their campus, and how it's a larger framing piece and a pillar of their institution in the ways that they socially embed or are socially embedded in their communities. Social embeddedness is infused into all of their language and the ways that they truly see themselves as an institution, but it's also that central pillar around which they can orient themselves. It's simultaneously centralized and decentralized in that messaging. I would also point to, so I mentioned earlier, like the Indiana University system, and really seeing the trend of identifying not just as one institution, but rather a system of institutions that is addressing the needs all throughout Indiana, just throughout the state, right? So while simultaneously focusing on local community needs, but also being the larger voice of the region and the state, and being a more collective voice. So again, it's that kind of, I don't want to say tension, but how the more granular storytelling is done in parallel with the larger institution or system-wide storytelling. And that comes through in a lot of ways, again, in the qualitative aspects of like individual stories of engaged faculty, but also in the larger, sometimes and often more quantitative aspects or data in the ways that, how their larger systems like that, like in Arizona State or like in Indiana University, are impacting the larger region in the ways that are the community define it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, where is your research taking you now?
Yeah. So my current scholarship has been more so through the lens of kind of what's happening after COVID, right? After COVID in quotation marks, right? And I've noticed a lot of change within institutions in terms of how they are strategically planning and how they are organizing themselves. So after or during COVID, right? Almost every institution was rewriting or revising or completely turning it over a new strategic plan. So a lot of my efforts in the last couple of years have been looking through the institution level plans of campuses and understanding or trying to understand how they are positioning engagement. So where it lives within a strategic plan, is it more dispersed? Is it more centralized? And then also what metrics or what are institutions using to assess if they are or are not making progress towards those goals? And I've seen a lot of really interesting pieces in terms of most campuses seem not to have metrics around specific engagement goals. And if they do, it's quite large in terms of like, we will have more engagement, right? And more is defined in a lot of different ways. So that's one lens that I've been kind of chewing on in the last couple of years. Also looking at the organizational structures of institutions. And again, kind of coming out of COVID, seeing a lot of shifting in terms of where engagement sits on a campus, who owns engagement, who doesn't own engagement, and really where the buck stops, essentially. And I think when we often see with new strategic plans or new leadership coming into campus, that often means a new or a reorganization of structure, and really trying to think through, does reorganization always lend itself towards the positive, or sometimes do we just shuffle things around because we feel like we should? So not necessarily trying to identify the best structures for engagement on a campus, but what typically tends to shake out as more successful for different institutional types.
Anything you'd like to add, Lauren?
I don't think so. Is there anything specific that you would want me to add?
What are your thoughts on Caitlin Clark's 3-point game?
On her what?
On her 3-point shot.
3-point game.
Yeah.
That is something that I see. Being in Indiana, so many people ask me my opinion of her, and I was like, good. Yeah, she's great. Like, she's one of the best things that have come to our city in a long time. So very proud to call her a Hoosier. Just for the time being. Yeah.
Lauren, thank you so much for joining us and sharing some thoughts, and for all the incredible work that you do. We're continuing to think through these questions ourselves, and hopefully our listeners around North America will take notice as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Below the Radar is a knowledge democracy podcast originally created by SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement. The Below the Radar B-sides are supported by Van City Credit Union. Thanks for listening to our conversation with Lauren Wendling. If you'd like to learn more about her work, head to the show notes below. Thanks for tuning in.